Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Equity Matters Seminar. Thank you all for being here today, especially in the midst of the ongoing challenges of the pandemic. I'm Katie Larson, Professor of English and Vice Dean Teaching, Learning and Undergraduate Programs at the University of Toronto Scarborough. My pronouns are she and her. I want to begin by recognizing that the land on which the University of Toronto operates is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. You can see a glimpse of one part of that land in my Zoom background, a photo that I took on a walk in the Highland Creek Valley behind the UTSC campus. For me, the act of acknowledging the land takes on particular resonance in the virtual framework in which we find ourselves. Each of us are connecting to this seminar from very different locations, some of us in Toronto and some of us from across Turtle Island. It's a gathering that highlights the many lands and territories that are represented in this Zoom space and invites us to reflect on those histories and our individual relationships with and responsibilities to that land. This year's Equity Matters seminar, Building a More Inclusive Curriculum, has been organized in conjunction with a campus-wide curriculum review led by a working circle at UTSC to ensure that the campus's commitment to inclusion, anti-racism, and indigeneity is embedded across programs and reflected in pedagogical approaches and supports. This work is central to UTSC's strategic plan, Inspiring Inclusive Excellence, but it has taken on new urgency in light of the challenges to equity illuminated during the pandemic, particularly in relation to anti-Black racism. Our guest speaker today, Professor Amy Tsuyoshi, will offer perspective into equity-focused curricular change and its relationship to student access and success. We will then have some discussion and take a short break. And in the second part of the seminar, which will reconvene at 2:30, we will have the opportunity to hear from 3 faculty members at the University of Toronto who are engaging in this work in their scholarship and pedagogical practice. A reminder that the seminar and panel will be recorded, and if you've not already turned off your mic to reduce background noise, please do so now. Live captioning is available, and if you would like to access that, please click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. During the discussion, audience members will have the opportunity to submit questions in writing using the Q&A webinar feature, which moderators will then share with the speakers. A reminder as we engage in discussion today that this seminar space reflects the University of Toronto's commitment to equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and the work of decolonization. Questions that are submitted should reflect that commitment, as well as a respect for the diverse perspectives and experiences that are represented in this Zoom space. Without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague, Professor Jessica Fields, Professor of Health Studies and Sociology, and newly appointed, announced today, Interim Vice Dean, Faculty Affairs, Equity and Success at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and co-moderator today to introduce our guest speaker. Professor Fields. You're muted.
Okay, classic. Here we go. Thank you so much, Katie. And it's an honor today to join you and our other colleagues for the conversation that Professor Tsuyoshi will lead. I want to offer a special thanks to Eileen Egan-Lee for helping us assemble today and ensuring that our technology, minus the mute button, was all clear and handled well. It's an enormous pleasure and honor to introduce Professor and Dean Amy Tsuyoshi, the Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. The San Francisco State College of Ethnic Studies is the first and longest standing college of its kind and home to 5 departments: Africana Studies, American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, Latino Studies, and Race and Resistance Studies. Amy is a historian by training with an undergraduate degree from Barnard College of Columbia University and a PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles. Her research area lies at the intersection of Asian American studies and sexuality studies. She has authored 2 books, Queer Compulsions, Race, Nation, and Sexuality in the Affairs of Yone Noguchi, and Discriminating Sex, White Leisure, and the Making of the American Oriental. She is also a founding co-curator of the GLBT History Museum in San Francisco, seeded the intergenerational Dragon Fruit Oral History Project at API Equality Northern California, and served as co-chair of the inaugural Queer History Conference 2019, hosted by the Committee on LGBT History. Amy is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Clio Award for her contribution to queer history and the Phoenix Award for her service to the Asian and Pacific Islander queer, women, and transgender community. These accomplishments reflect Amy's deep commitments to racial, sexual, and gender justice, to her communities, and to academic life. She is a sought-after mentor, teacher, colleague, and leader, and the time I spent as her colleague and friend at San Francisco State is truly among the most valuable of my professional life. We're lucky to have Amy with us at UTSC. Please welcome me in joining her and welcoming her this afternoon. Professor Tsuyoshi.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, does that look good? If someone could say something just to make sure that it's all.
That looks
okay,
great.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so thanks to Jessica Fields for inviting me here today. I'm so honored to be in conversation with you folks about building a more inclusive curriculum. I just have to start by giving you a heads up that as I was preparing for this talk and browsing through your webpage, I decided to change gears at the last minute and focus more specifically on your theme for Equity Matters, which I believe is about literally building a more inclusive curriculum. I will talk about the findings that Institutional Analytics uncovered on the correlation of ethnic studies courses and student success. I'm hoping to frame the findings more directly to what you may be seeking. As Jessica mentioned, I am in the College of Ethnic Studies at State, which is a pretty unique place in that it's an entire college as opposed to just a single department or program. And it's in fact one of 6 academic colleges that comprise the university. Just to give you a sense of the size of the College of Ethnic Studies, it houses the 5 departments of Africana Studies, American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, Latino Studies, and a comparative ethnic studies unit called Race and Resistance Studies. We have 4 additional initiatives as well, most of them within Race and Resistance Studies, which serves as kind of an incubator for our, quote, new directions in ethnic studies. They are Arab, Muslim ethnicities and diasporas, critical mixed race studies, critical Pacific Islands and Oceania studies, and queer ethnic studies. The college currently offers 5 major degree programs and 9 minors. And in fall of 2019, the 5 departments altogether had 235 majors and 303 minors. As you can see, Latino studies had the largest number of majors with 93 students, and Race and Resistance Studies had the largest number of minors with 138 students. Each semester, we offer upwards 9,000 seats in over 170 classes in nearly all areas of the general education. In academic year 2018-19, the college offered 18,815 seats across 643 sections. The College of Ethnic Studies remains the first and the longest standing college of its kind, as Jessica mentioned. Fans of Star Trek refer to us as the mothership of ethnic studies. Because we stand as an entire college of 5 departments within a university, we are unusual. What's not unusual about the College of Ethnic Studies, though, is that it has actually been in constant struggle to build a more inclusive curriculum, particularly around race, much like institutions everywhere. Today, what I'd like to do is first talk about why inclusive education is important. Many of you are already familiar with this literature, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. And then I'll spend the remainder of my time giving you a few examples of how SFSU struggled with implementing inclusive education. I'm hoping here to give some examples that might resonate with your campus. Again, my understanding is that my talk today is supposed to spark conversation. The most important takeaway, though, if you forget everything else, is that building an inclusive curriculum It must be an always kind of thing. It has no start nor end date. It just has to be all the time, ongoing, and a part of academic life. It should be so ingrained in an institution that it becomes just something you do every workday, like brushing your teeth or checking your email. Okay, so why is inclusive education important? I'm going to talk here specifically about ethnic studies. For those of you who are not familiar with ethnic studies, it's the study of US people of color and indigenous folks that grew out of the student movements in the late 1960s. The idea to provide culturally relevant and transformative education dates back to at least 1903 with W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks. The Indian New Deal of the 1930s also set the stage for the rise of community-based day schools. At San Francisco State, the founding strikers of the College of Ethnic Studies were immersed in Black liberation movements of the time, particularly the Black Panther Party. They espoused student-driven education that led to self-determination rather than integration. I want to be clear here that ethnic studies is not the study of different ethnicities or cultures around the world, but rather the study of power, self-determination or sovereignty, and liberation. It was supposed to be called Third World Studies, but after all the dust settled from the cops beating up the student protesters, administrators conceded, but only with the caveat that it take on the less radical name of ethnic studies. So since its establishment, countless publications have detailed the efficacy of ethnic studies for student achievement for both white and non-white students. In 2011, Christine Sleeter compiled a review of the literature on the academic and social value of ethnic studies. She looked at more than 90 publications and found that research unequivocally argued that ethnic studies better engage students, and this was just for K through 12 education. Sleeter noted ethnic studies curriculum as successful because it directly addresses racism rather than only portraying diverse communities. This framework produces higher levels of thinking and has positive impact on, quote, democracy outcomes, particularly for white students, since a systemic analysis of power and cross-racial interaction is newer to whites than to students of color. Clearly, over the past 10 years, since Sleeter, there's been an increasing number of publications advancing the efficacy of ethnic studies. And one of these additional publications was one that I co-authored with Suti Sujit Parapitaya, Associate Provost of Institutional Analytics. We look specifically at SFSU and the impact of ethnic studies. Suti had already been generating data on our student retention and graduation rates when he and Lori Beth Way, the Dean of the Division of Undergrad Education Academic Planning, noticed a striking number of comments on the productivity of ethnic studies from graduating seniors in the SAP study. So they decided to more closely examine the connection between ethnic studies and the graduation outcome of first-time freshmen. Suti and his team analyzed a sample of 22,250 first-time freshmen who entered from fall 2008 to fall 2013. Of those, 291 ethnic studies majors, 295 ethnic studies minors, and 8,250 ethnic studies non-majors and non-minors were included in the comparison based on their last declared major and minor during the 6-year period. And they found that majors graduating with ethnic studies degrees had remarkable graduation rates at an average of 73.2%. And keep in mind, this is in relation to graduation rates in the high 50s for the rest of the university. Data also pointed to a strong correlation of higher graduation rates for students who took ethnic studies courses, even when they weren't majors in the College of Ethnic Studies. And I want to talk through a few tables. The article that Jessica sent around does go into much more detail with more tidbits that could be useful for you when making the case for ethnic studies. So Suti separated first-time freshmen into 3 groups. Group 1 were students who at graduation declared majors in the College of Ethnic Studies. Group 2 were students who declared minors in the College of Ethnic Studies. And group 3 were students who did not declare majors nor minors in the College of Ethnic Studies and did not complete any ethnic studies classes. You'll see under on the table under group 1, it says ethnic studies first and second majors. That label is to just indicate that we scooped up the double majors as well, who had a second major in the College of Ethnic Studies. The evidence indicated that ethnic studies majors, group 1, had the highest 6-year graduation rates, averaging at 73.2%. You can see this in the row across from overall. In striking contrast, the graduation rates of ethnic studies non-majors and non-minors who did not complete any ethnic studies classes, this is group 3, was 34.3%. And this is, if you look at the difference, it's about 38.9 percentage points lower than the ethnic studies major. And that the difference is this column here that's group 1 versus group 3 in yellow. We also found that ethnic studies majors, group 1, took an average of 1 semester longer to graduate at 4.78 years. Right, here's the 4.78. Than students who did not declare ethnic studies majors or minors in group 3, who graduated in 4.45 years. The additional semester makes sense in light of the fact that ethnic studies majors are typically discovery majors in which students who may have previously declared a different major, quote, discover ethnic studies later in their college career. I want to be clear here that this is a correlation and does not necessarily indicate a causal relationship. I also want to look at cumulative GPA at graduation. This is also on this chart here. We found that ethnic studies non-majors and non-minors had the highest average GPA at a graduation at 3.18, and that's here. You can see my little arrow moving around here. Versus ethnic studies minors group 2 had the second highest at 3.16. And then group 1 came in just below those of 9 majors at 3.07. Here's the 3.07. The lower GPA, again, may be reflective of a previously declared major in which students were unhappy before finding a home in ethnic studies. So again, correlation doesn't necessarily indicate causal. However, it did validate what BIPOC faculty had believed. BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color faculty had believed since the founding of the college that students who took ethnic studies classes did better in school. And it demonstrated to all the faculty outside of ethnic studies that classes on race and power were good for students in terms of graduation rates. It created an opportunity for us to have more allies across the university, both faculty and administrators alike. And now we could tell academic advisors more explicitly to encourage their students to take ethnic studies courses, particularly if they were struggling to engage in school. So as Suti crunched the numbers, he tasked me to explain the possible, quote, why behind the correlation. Again, I'm not making the case for a direct causal line. However, I did find some notable differences among our faculty versus those in other colleges within the university. So just to give you some context, at SFSU, our students are 82% of color, around 40% Pell eligible or low-income students, and 30% first-generation college students. We are a HSI, ANAPISI, and MSI, which means we serve a large number of Latinx, Asian, and Pacific Islander students, and students who are generally brown and Black. We don't have a very high percentage of Black students. We're at 5%, which is close to the population of African Americans in San Francisco, as well as California. In the College of Ethnic Studies, we have between 130 and 140 faculty, and this includes lectures. Among the 44 tenure track faculty, all are BIPOC. Moreover, 25 are women of color, comprising 56% of the tenure track faculty. Some departments are even up to 70% women of color. And unofficially, 7 or 16% of our faculty are queer identified. In stark contrast, at SFSU in particular, among the tenure track faculty, of which there are 854, 37% is of color. the national professoriate is only 1/4 of color. Across the US, women of color hold between 2.5 and 4.8% of tenure track positions and 2.2 to 2.6% of tenured positions. For fall 2019, our more than 90 lecturers were nearly all of color or Native American. This past fall, SFSU welcomed 5 new Black faculty members. 2 of them, though, were in the College of Ethnic Studies, which means the other 5 colleges in the university hired 3 African Americans total, which again points to a very different hiring practice within the College of Ethnic Studies. The college's ideological origins in 1968 and its very form as an autonomous college has allowed for an academic culture that departs from traditional departments. Ethnic Studies faculty members' primary concern focuses on relevant curriculum and students' holistic well-being. For countless hours referred by feminists as invisible labor, faculty meet with students, console them through crises, advise them on their academic trajectory, feed students when they're hungry, and even find housing when they're homeless. Faculty in the College of Ethnic Studies also see value in teaching general ed courses as a gateway for student transformation, as opposed to instructors in more traditional departments who may prefer to teach upper division courses or courses exclusive to students in their major. Faculty also generally understand student delays, exceptions, withdrawals, with the full realization that students are trying to obtain a college degree, often in the face of overwhelming responsibilities or difficulties off campus. And finally, instructors are deeply embedded in community projects and movements as scholar activists who see academia as by necessity engaged in the external world around them. And this way of being a teacher is considered as you know, a high impact practice. Teaching this becomes central in their mission to create a more just and compassionate world through higher education. Between 2015 and 2018, San Francisco State conducted 4 types of surveys. Collectively, the 4 surveys not only affirm the significantly positive standing of ethnic studies courses among students' academic experience, but also illuminated how students see pedagogy in the College of Ethnic Studies as distinctly different from the other colleges at State. Majors in the college reported more engagement in 6 of the 7 areas of high impact practices, and students across the university reported ethnic studies explicitly as unique and valuable during their time at State. And as incredible as all this may sound, we have faced a number of ongoing battles to establish and advance ethnic studies in our 50-year history. In 1965, Associated Students, which is our student government, pushed forward 3 initiatives. One was an experimental college in which students organized and offered classes never previously seen in the college bulletin. 2, the community involvement program, which placed students in low-income neighborhoods throughout the city to help support them in their efforts. And 3, a tutorial program for children to help them with reading and math so they could stay in school. They were considered successful in that they provided students with an education that the institution was not providing, relevant education rooted in community. The Black Arts and Culture Series was initiated in the experimental college in fall 1966. And the following year, Black Studies was enacted with 11 classes taught by faculty and graduate students on a voluntary basis or part-time. The then president of San Francisco State, without consultation with anyone but the Black Student Union, then arbitrarily appointed a Black Studies coordinator, Nathan Hare, to keep the campus from, quote, splitting wide open. And by 1968, Hare had designed a Black Studies BA for approval by the Board of Trustees. Hare, however, was removed from his position before approval of the BA, and in fall 1968, the BSU and the Third World Liberation Front then went on to hold the longest student strike in US history. And in fall 1969, this is sort of the fast rendition of the strike, Ethnic Studies was formed with the 4 departments of American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, Black Studies, and Raza Studies. When you look back at this period, it's pretty incredible to think about all that happened in just a little over 3 years. Students co-created a curriculum they wanted to see with grad students and faculty who then volunteer taught before a department could be formed. In the 1980s, ethnic studies would face another critical juncture with the revision of the general education. We knew we had to get into as many parts of the GE as possible, despite the fact that, for example, the history department didn't think our faculty could teach a course that could fulfill the history requirement. But we did manage to get into nearly every GE in the social science and humanities, including critical thinking. And this has helped our enrollments over the decades. We did have to make one pretty big concession. There's this thing, it's called an overlay. It's called AERM, which stands for American Ethnic and Racial Minorities. We had to say it's okay for other faculty in other departments outside of the College of Ethnic Studies to teach classes that fulfill AERM if we were going to be able to teach classes that also fulfilled the English and history requirements for these departments were outside of our college. And then in 2016, the college faced another challenge when the provost sought to deliberately underfund us. Since the financial crisis of 2007, we were consistently being allocated less than our state mandated salaries. That meant on the first day of class, we were already $250,000 in the red. And in the past, the provost covered it with carry forward funds. But in spring 2016, the provost suddenly said that we had to be held, quote, accountable for our, quote, irresponsible spending. This meant that we would have to cut all of our lecture funded courses, which was about 40% of our curriculum, and then reduce the size of the departments by not hiring into lines vacated by retiring faculty. The students began protesting and asking for financial transparency. The president and provost just ignored the demonstrations until May 2016, when 4 students went on a hunger strike and the cuts were rescinded. In fact, a year later, nearly all of the demands were met. While the most dramatic contentions over inclusive curriculum have been student-led, I'd like to also highlight that administratively, there's a ton of things that can be done with less drama that's just as much, if not more significant. Now, just to give you 3 examples. The first one is the 1980s incorporation of ethnic studies courses into GE. And it's not just one course, it's nearly 80% of our courses are currently in the GE. And this is also very much dependent on the fact that our faculty are on GE committees and at the table when there's any kind of baccalaureate review. Recently, we got into, our courses have also been approved for both oral communication, which is one of the lower division GEs, as well as a ethnic studies QR, quantitative reasoning course. Also, when other departments refuse to offer their GE classes, we always volunteer to have our college offer the classes instead. Thus, when philosophy decided they didn't want to offer so many critical thinking classes because their faculty would rather teach upper division courses, the AVP of Academic Resources came to ethnic studies to fill the university's unmet demand. He didn't have to give the courses to us. He could have given it to a different college, but he did. And it boosted our FTES, our enrollments, by 30% and rebenched our allocation when a new provost came in. So for my third example, partnerships with other departments, colleges, and divisions within the university is super useful. We previously did not have a good relationship with the College of Extended Learning, which is our self-support program. They basically just ignored us. They considered us too niche and not a moneymaker. So CEL, or the College of Extended Learning, more likely pursued partnerships with the College of Business, as well as the College of Science and Engineering. But now we are mounting 2 new programs with CEL. One is an online degree completion program for folks who have dropped out of college, and the other is an online certificate for incarcerated youth. Both programs align with our core values since they serve underserved students and simultaneously bring revenue into the college. Another administrative partnership, obviously, is the one that we had with Institutional Analytics, where they kept an eye out for the College of Ethnic Studies and made connections about student graduation or retention rates and ethnic studies. With these three administrative examples, we can see how faculty and staff are working together to advance inclusive curriculum. You'll notice that it's not on the backs of faculty of color, and in fact, students of color are not involved at all. While students often take tremendous action towards changing the university, it's in fact our job to change the university, not the students. So where do we go from here? In 2019, a surge of mainstream media outlets such as Forbes magazine, The Atlantic, CNBC, and the New York Times reported on America's completion crisis, or higher education's, quote, dropout problem. And it was an alarming catastrophe for not just individual students, but society as a whole, since it would widen racial and economic disparities and fuel social problems within a nation that would be largely of color by 2050. And in 2020, as the nation reeled in outrage against the state-sanctioned killing of unarmed Black men and the movement for Black lives gained mass momentum, curriculum in ethnic studies and Africana studies specifically became more salient in the fight against anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Notably, in June of the same year, the California State Senate passed AB 1460, which would require all CSU undergraduates to take a 3-unit ethnic studies course. Yet, we continue to face difficulties in its implementation since it appears that the Chancellor's office, the Chancellor is charged with all 23 campuses of our system, is in fact against the requirement. So indeed, the struggle never ends, and I encourage all of you to continue to engage in difficult work of making our communities more compassionate and just by advancing inclusive education. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks so much for the remarks. And I'm sure, I wish we were all in the same room so that we could applaud you as you so rightfully deserve. So just a reminder for folks, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and folks can enter their questions there. I will read the questions to Amy and share them with her. I might find myself consolidating questions, so I won't take the time to read names as I'm asking those questions, but I encourage you to be in touch with the Dean's office and with Amy afterwards to continue the conversation if that's something you'd like to pursue. Amy referred to an article in the remarks, and for those of you who haven't seen that yet, it'll go out to attendees after today's webinar. So I have a couple questions that I can get us started with while folks get their questions into the Q&A box. And before I pose mine, I'll just remind folks of the sort of guidelines that Professor Larson offered us as we got started about the spirit of our conversation today and our commitment to inclusion and diversity and equity as we enter the discussion. So Amy, I think I'd like to go back to this idea that you offered us of the discovery major. And thinking about the ways that students come or don't come to university committed to discovery, and the way that that spirit of discovery is not always in line with the spirit of the university as people are contending with economic pressures and other pressures to be quite instrumental in their education. And I wondered if you could talk a little more about how you sustain that spirit of discovery, and both within the students, but also insisting that the university hold on to that spirit of discovery.
So we serve, our mission is to serve the working poor of California. And so we understand that many of our students come to college with a very specific goal of getting a baccalaureate degree and finding a job, right? So in many cases, that means that students will come to state, for a health degree or an engineering degree or a business degree. They don't think that an ethnic studies degree is going to necessarily get them, a job, let alone a job that's high paying enough to support themselves and their families. We recognize that, but we also try to do things like promote the fact that with an ethnic studies major, you can be anything, you can do anything. You could become a teacher, right? You could, work in social services or in government agencies, right? And so one thing that we do is first we try to educate students that an ethnic studies major can actually get you a job by profiling alum. The other thing that we do administratively, and I want to be more successful with this, is I've been trying to get the university to promote students to take their GE, the general ed, in the College of Ethnic Studies. So because we're part of the history of the government, the critical thinking, oral comm, all these different GE areas, we encourage other students who are not necessarily our majors coming in to take those classes in the GE. And through taking ethnic studies courses in the GE, they discover that ethnic studies could be transformative to them. And because our courses are in the GE, they can very easily get a minor in ethnic studies just by taking their GE courses in ethnic studies. And then also some of them may choose that, they don't want to be a science major or a business major. And so they can rapidly then shift to a ethnic studies major instead. And so we try to also make it administratively very easy for students to discover majors and then change, discover curriculum and then change their majors to that discovered curriculum if they choose to do so. And I've been more or less successful. I think that in some parts of the college, we've been able to have faculty encourage and academic advisors encourage students to take the GE in ethnic studies. I do a roadshow every year for Chairs Council in College of Business, as well as Science and Engineering, to tell the chairs to encourage their students to take their GE in ethnic studies, precisely because of the retention and graduation rates.
Thank you. I have another question to share with you from one of our attendees. I wonder if you could give us more detail about the general education piece and talk about, in particular, whether this involved aligning courses from the College of Ethnic Studies with existing requirements, or whether there were actual changes to the requirements themselves along with that.
Yeah, so we haven't actually changed the GE in quite some time. We might have added a graduation requirement here and there, but they're usually state mandated requirements. So it's actually very difficult to change the GE. And AB 1460 is the most recent change that folks were able to implement. It was a 3-year process, and it went through the state legislature. The governor had to sign it. And then the Board of Trustees had to basically abide by it. But previously, the Board of Trustees didn't want to change the GE. So I actually don't recommend changing the GE if it's really an arduous process. What we did was we basically aligned our classes with the existing GE. So let me just give you an example. So if there's an Asian American history class, right? We basically made the argument that Asian American history class was also teaching US history, because we're basically focusing on Asian Americans within the larger context of US history. So we're still talking about sort of all the major issues in US history, but it's through the lens of Asian American history. And so, it had to go through, obviously, committee approval through the Senate, the Baccalaureate Review Committee. We also have a GE committee for both lower division, upper division. There's student learning outcomes, and we just have to make sure that the syllabi align. And once we get that approval, then it becomes part of the regular GE that hasn't been changed. And we've been more successful getting our courses in that way. Obviously, the challenges we faced, I talked a little bit about that in the talk. Initially, the faculty in the other departments were like, oh, well, how could you possibly teach a history course? It's one part racism, right? They don't realize that the folks of color in the Ethnic Studies College have a history PhD, for example. And so that was one barrier that we've continued to face. When we recently got approved for the oral comm class, the oral comm requirement, we had communications come to us and was really angry. They said, how did you get this class approved? Because their dean had let it, usually the dean approves it for each college, and their dean had let it go through without consultation. And so we had to have a meeting with them and show communications that the faculty member who was teaching that class was actually held a PhD in communications, and then they relented. So that's an ongoing problem that pops up it's sort of ugly head every now and then. But the one concession we did have to make was that we had to allow the other departments to also teach classes that it would seem our college would have a block on. So things like AERM, which is American Ethnic and Racial Minorities. The new requirement, AB 1460, is a requirement in ethnic studies, which means that only ethnic studies faculty can teach it. So that's actually something that we can't share with the other departments, mandated by the state of California.
Great. And I'm realizing that I think I'm the only person who has access to all of the questions that come in. So if anyone wants to ask a follow-up, you can signal that in the Q&A if there's a person who's posed a question and wants to hear more. So a couple of folks have asked about involvements of different disciplines and departments, Amy, and you mentioned the involvement of humanities and social sciences, less about science departments. And I wonder is that about, or the questioner wonders, is this about the departments not having an interest in playing a role here? Is there a way to think about them being involved in curricular change and inclusive pedagogies that's maybe particular to science?
Yeah, so the one thing that the partnership that we have been able to forge with science is we've been able to get lower division and upper division science classes that are in the GE approved as part of the GE. So at the upper division, we have a Decolonize Your Diet, about a class called Decolonize Your Diet about indigenous foods and public health. And there are faculty from the College of Science and Engineering who sit on that curriculum review committee, and they approved it, right? And we also have a lower division. We have like a Native American ecology class that was also approved. And so in that way, we do have curricular sort of respect and agreement among each other. We're trying to develop right now a QR course, a quantitative reasoning course. I mean, we've actually developed we've developed a QR course in Asian American Studies. And right now we're trying to develop one in Africana Studies to encourage more Black scientists, more Black students to go into STEM. And I'm actually working with a faculty member in biology to hopefully design a Black Studies QR course and then teach it for the College of Ethnic Studies. We don't have anyone in Africana Studies who could teach a QR course right now. So that's one collaboration that we're working on. It's definitely a collaboration that's done between people, right? So I tell our faculty all the time to make friends across the university, particularly in the College of Business, as well as the College of Science and Engineering. And those are the relationships with whom we're able to foster collaborative curriculum, ways of thinking about encouraging more of our students to go into STEM fields as well as business fields. The business school has been more difficult to sort of get collaborations on. We do also have allies though in the College of Business. There's a white lesbian who does work on Black accountants, and she's been super eager to get more African American students into her accounting program. So that's been fantastic as well. So you know, it's slow, it's step by step, but I haven't, it's still going on. Our natural affinity, obviously, because we're a liberal arts college, is in the social sciences and in humanities, but that also natural affinity also sometimes causes heated rivalries because we are also competing in some ways for the same students. And it's become very clear that the students would rather take a critical thinking class in the College of Ethnic Studies versus philosophy. So there'll be tons of open sections in philosophy, and all of our sections will be filled. And sometimes philosophy gets a little bit angry with us. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. Like having the close affinity also creates some pretty heated kerfuffles sometimes. But it's not that we're not collaborating with business and science. It's just that it takes a little more work, I guess is what I'd like to say. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to stay in this place about relationships between departments for a moment because there are a few questions here. And one question is specifically about examples in working with colleagues from business. And I wonder if you might elaborate the student engagement that the colleague in the College of Business is engaged in, or some other piece that from the College of Business that you could tell us about.
Yeah, so it's tricky, right? Because also, College of Ethnic Studies, we are ideologically anti-capitalist, right? So it's like, okay, how much, it's my job actually as dean to convince our faculty to collaborate with folks in College of Business. I think, science and engineering is a little bit of an easier sell for our faculty, but College of Business is a little more tricky because of our ideological foundation, right? But I do think that there's things like places where there is alignment, like entrepreneurship or small business kind of stuff, right? We actually do have a PhD in economics in Latino studies, and I would like her to do more stuff around, with the College of Business. I haven't been successful convincing her yet. I want to also be very frank that I'm taking classes in the College of Business, so there's quite a few faculty members who have been very helpful to me, have actually said that they're willing to collaborate with us. And so I also have a number of emails out thinking about like joint hires, right, in the College of Business with the College of Ethnic Studies. So, at one point I approached Decision Sciences. I knew that they were going to get another faculty hire, and I knew that our college wouldn't. And so I approached them and I said, hey, you want to do a joint hire? Like you can do, 3/4 in your department and 1/4 in our college. And the faculty member coming in can pick what any department in the College of Ethnic Studies, right? Decision Sciences, though, at that time said no. So I have to figure out how to be more persuasive in the future. But I do think that the conversation that's open and available is a starting point. I want to also say that the dean of the College of Business, we're quite friendly, and we have a very good relationship as well. He's actually a new dean. Their mission is actually social justice, believe it or not, which is a good thing, but unusual for business schools generally. And he's already been thinking about, he's working on a project to think about diversity, equity, inclusion, selling some kind of seminar to corporations. I've talked to my faculty about it, and they would rather just give it away for free as a MOOC, right? So again, very, very sort of foundational differences, but we are in collaboration to design something to help corporations be better hiring African Americans, Latinx folks, as well as in some cases Asian Americans.
Excellent. I'm going to shift a little bit to curriculum questions, come back to
Sure.
some departmental relations questions if we have more time. But
Sure.
some folks have asked questions about how ethnic studies faculty might consult with other departments and helping them to think about conversations about race and equity in the classroom, maybe in departmental practices that could be instrumental to developing the student's identity and their sense of belonging within those major disciplines as well.
Yeah, so we could do better about being in conversation with faculty across the university, but we do have some formal structures of conversation. One is around new course curriculum. So a faculty member in one department may want to mount a course in Black liberation movements or something like that. And then they would have to come and consult with Africana Studies to see if that is a non-duplicative, right? And then the faculty members together would review the syllabi, right? People would give suggestions to each other, right? And think about a more appropriate title if it's not really about Black liberation for that faculty member teaching the class. Our faculty are also, because we're ethnic studies and, we have a legacy of being sort of trampled upon, not just in higher ed, but in US history. Right? So we tend to be a little more suspicious of faculty in other colleges teaching courses in ethnic studies, particularly if it's white faculty. I'm going to be very frank about this. In terms of appropriation, right? There is a trend across other universities where other departments will be teaching ethnic studies courses, and then the president then decides to shut down the ethnic studies program because now it's diffuse across the university. And so those are the things that we're very protective of. And we say it very explicitly. I think that Californians, as nice as we are, the folks of color can also be pretty like hey, we're just going to tell you how it is, right? And so we say very frankly that, we're worried about being appropriated. We're worried about getting shut down if ethnic studies courses become too diffuse across the university. And, the white faculty, frankly, they get it. And I do feel like I'm in a special place where white faculty sort of can hear, understand, and then back off and know that it's also their job to protect ethnic studies as well. It's not just the ethnic studies faculty. It's basically a university endeavor that has to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
I think also that there's also ways in which students of color who are having difficulties in other parts of the university and are not majoring in ethnic studies come to our faculty, our departments for support when they face difficulty around the curriculum. And when that happens, usually the faculty member comes to me as the dean just to let me know. I then talk to the dean of the other college, and we have an informal conversation around faculty members that might need more coaching in terms of having a more welcoming environment. But it's nothing is as dreamy and wonderful as it may sound. All of it is not always successful and takes quite a bit of work.
Thanks. I'm going to stick with curriculum for a little bit here.
Sure.
Excuse me. So a couple more questions about this curriculum and the sciences in particular. So the one question from a science educator is, what might some of the learning outcomes or teaching philosophies in ethnic studies be that would be beneficial to incorporate into the science curriculum? So sort of thinking about ethnic studies outcomes and philosophies, and then a particular interest in science history courses that might think about Henrietta Lacks. And yeah, so if you could take those on, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the panel that's following this would be a wonderful place to think about student learning outcomes for the sciences. But I do want to say that one of our key student learning outcomes that spans all the departments in the College of Ethnic Studies is to think about communities of color as sites of liberation and change, right? So if there's a student learning outcome that I presume, and I'm just kind of brainstorming here, if you can think about a student learning outcome in a science class that talks about sort of all people being agents of creating science, right? That's part of it, right? And I think science history is absolutely important. But the thing that I want to underscore is that folks of color in your science history courses have to be more than just victims. They actually have to be change agents, right? Communities of color, indigenous folks are not inspired by only hearing stories of oppression and being sort of ripped off and getting their stuff stolen. That's not really inspiring. They really need to hear stories of scientists of color, indigenous scientists, like people making inventions, right? Like just doing incredible work that changes the world, right? In addition, obviously, to how the fact that maybe then some white guy came along and stole their work and put a patent on it or something like that. But it needs to be both. It can't just be about oppression and abuse. And I suspect that this science education knows that, but it's super important to be thinking about ethnic studies courses and not just illuminating structural inequality, but also inspiring students to take charge and giving them the tools to become leaders in whatever field they want.
I wonder if that's part of the role that the faculty themselves play then in the College of Ethnic Studies, as both documenting and helping students gain insight into these histories of violence, not only violence, but often violence, but also themselves serving as models or inspiration. Does that seem to be the case? And perhaps the answer is obviously yes, but then another question might be here, what is the cost then to the faculty of being that? Maybe we can talk a little bit about the experience of the faculty doing this work.
Yeah, so I mean, I got to tell you that it's exhausting, and I do, obviously we know that it's important to hire faculty of color. I can't even tell you how many times both the faculty in the College of Ethnic Studies, as well as myself, when I was full-time in the classroom, we would hear constantly how incredible it is to see a person such as ourselves as a faculty member. Um, the other thing to kind of note is that, in American Indian Studies, Africana Studies, right? In many other universities, those departments are either 1/4 to a half white faculty. For our college, it's all faculty of color or all Indigenous faculty. And that in and of itself, when students come by, walk down the hallway, see the bulletin board of faculty, is incredibly inspiring. I've seen other faculty also who are they're on the job market. They come to our campus for interviews and they look at that bulletin board and they're super moved. It's no doubt that it's moving and important, not just to the students, but also to the faculty of color across the university. With that said, they do take on more work, right? In terms of not just for their own students, but also students who are, don't have majors in ethnic studies or minors in ethnic studies, who then come to us because they're having difficulty. I want to just let you know also that I did a preliminary a review of students and their Pell Grant and first gen status. And our college majors are at a higher proportion of Pell Grant recipients, meaning low income, as well as first gen college students. So it also means that many of our majors actually have more stuff that they're carrying around and less resources to help them carry it around. At the same time, because we are all doing it together, right? It doesn't, my faculty don't complain about it. I mean, they don't say that, Amy, we're doing all this invisible labor. I have to be very frank though, that the women faculty do complain that the men faculty are not carrying their fair share. But generally speaking, our faculty just do it. They know that there's an obligation to the students and they do it. Now, if you look at faculty in other colleges at San Francisco State, they can see that their colleague in the same department may not be doing the invisible labor that they're doing, and they are not happy at all. But I do not have that problem because our entire college, as an administrator, I don't have the problem because as a college, all of our faculty in it are invested in giving that extra, stuff to students. In the slideshow, I talked a little bit about this, but many of our faculty have extra sandwiches, bring fruit, buy things from our bulk store called Costco. I don't know if you have that in Canada, and then give that out to students. Give that out to students who come to their office because they know that they're hungry. The thing that I'm not supposed to know about is that we also have faculty who have allowed students to sleep in their offices when they're homeless. I don't recommend that you do that because it's actually illegal, but I do know that our faculty have really gone the extra mile to help students out, and it's moving for me, and that's what allows me to also continue in this position serving them.
What other supports are available on campus as you think about this invisible labor that faculty of color in the College of Ethnic Studies are doing? How could we think about this institutionally to recognize and support the labor that these faculty are engaged in?
So I do think that in terms of your retention, tenure, and promotion process, that it's really important to think of service as crucial, as an important third component of these three things. We have a joke in the College of Ethnic Studies that you have to publish, teach well, and start a revolution, which is the service part. And you don't really have to start a revolution, but we do take the service part quite seriously. So I think that's one thing that absolutely needs to happen. I also think that the student affairs side needs to be very, very well developed or better developed, right? So even just 4 years ago, we didn't have student resource centers for students of color. And just recently, we got a Black Unity Center, a Dream Resource Center, like all these different resource centers for students who are typically under-resourced at our university. And those departments or divisions or offices in student affairs has also taken up the slack for much of the invisible labor. So we also have a committee in student affairs that works on what's called Basic Needs Initiative. We have a food pantry that just started 4 years ago when the other CSUs had food pantries. Like, it's ridiculous, right? Like all these things that student affairs could have been doing, they weren't doing, but now they are doing it. And that's greatly helped the ways in which our faculty has had to support our students over the past 5 decades. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to use that response to move to a discussion of students some more. You talked about how the students were involved in the past in the co-creation of curriculum,
Yes.
and in launching this whole project. How are the students involved now in the creation or co-creation of curriculum?
Yeah, so there are some, the experimental college is still going on. They just rebooted it. I think maybe 5 years ago, they rebooted it again. So it was revived. And then also, our faculty, depending on, who you are and what kind of pedagogy they employ, they might have a day when students can think about sort of what kinds of things they want to read, right? And so there's those things as well. In terms of, they also sorry, I'm getting very excited. There's other things like the Pacific Islander students really wanted to see a minor, right? They wanted to see Pacific Islander faculty and also curriculum. And so they came to us, the College of Ethnic Studies, and said, hey, we really want to see this. And we had a couple of conversations with both American Indian Studies and Asian American Studies, as well as the students. And it was a PI student organization, which is considered a historic organization at state. And we were able to not only get 2 hires in Pacific Islander Studies, which is like a miracle. We also then designed a minor, which got approved. And now the 2 new assistant professors are hard at work trying to design a major. And I've told them to not do that until they get tenure, because I want them to be protected. But also, we've been thinking about, like, there's another department in sexuality studies that hired a specialist in Native Hawaiian stuff, queer, trans Native Hawaiian stuff. And so we've been, the faculty have gotten together, created sort of like a work group among themselves, and have sent up a bunch of, questions to our associate dean. And so we're trying to support that. But that's definitely a student-driven curriculum piece that happened. It was actually also a grad student in our MA program in ethnic studies that did a whole study on Pacific Islander programs across the state of California. And they were particularly located in the community college. And so she saw the need for it to be done at a CSU campus. And so, she worked on this pretty heavily as well. So that's just one example of something that is a very good story with a very, very, like a story with a very good happy ending. But obviously it's not ended yet, but yeah, we're super happy about that. So we do take, like, a lot of our minor, like a lot of the minors we created are definitely, they came out of sort of student demand and student request. We're also designing actually a major, it's an all college major, meaning not in one of the departments, but the entire college, on race, ethnicity, and health. And that also came out of student demand because there were so many students of color who were getting rejected from the public health major because it's an impacted major. And so they were coming to us in ethnic studies and getting, for example, an Asian American studies major, but we wanted to give them a degree where they could actually go into a health field, get a job in a health field. And so we designed this major. It took a little bit of finessing with public health, who felt like we were encroaching, but definitely we work with students to try to give them curriculum that they want.
And what happens to the students who are in the more conventional public health degree program? Are they still engaged in the questions around race, liberation, and so on that are now institutionally located in the race, ethnicity, and health major?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
I hope so. Yeah. The public health department actually has a number of faculty of color in it. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily ethnic studies trained. They might be a sort of like a more conventional health trained body.
Mhm.
Our health degree, which has not been approved yet, so don't tell too many people that were otherwise, might not get through Senate. But our health degree is definitely is more unconventional. So it has more like ethnic studies courses, like in one of the domains, we have all these history classes on people of color in there first as a way of thinking about health, right? For communities of color. So it's a little unconventional than the more traditional public health degree. But I'm presuming that the public health program continues to abide by philosophies that align with the university's mission around social justice.
Great. I wanted to ask a question about whiteness studies. Is there a place for critical whiteness studies within the College of Ethnic Studies? And how do you wrestle with or not wrestle with the history of the term ethnicity, which invokes also, Irish people, German people, Jewish people? I mean, how do you wrestle with or contend with that other project around whiteness?
Yeah, so I want to be very clear that ethnic studies, and I talked a little bit about this in the presentation, is not really, it wasn't supposed to be named ethnic studies. It was supposed to be named third world studies. And so I do think that there's a conflation that ethnic studies is about sort of larger ethnicities and could be even about global like area studies, could be about global cultures, right? But that is not what ethnic studies is about. And so in some ways we don't deal with the things about sort of these other sort of white ethnicities in America in our curriculum. We might deal with them in terms of like, for instance, when I teach the history of U.S. people of color course, obviously I talk about white ethnics, right? The Irish and the Italians in sort of conversation with other communities of color, but the frame is always through an ethnic studies lens, which means the frame is always through a third world liberation lens, okay? So that's sort of one thing that I just want to clarify. There is room for whiteness studies in the College of Ethnic Studies if the faculty choose that that's something that they want to do. Now, the faculty already look at whiteness studies in their classes, in their curriculum, when they talk about white supremacy, right? But we haven't hired a faculty member that specializes in whiteness studies, nor do I think that our faculty would necessarily, just because also ethnic studies, yes, is about uncovering structural inequality, but it's also about liberation and transformation. I want to also just bring up that when I was an assistant professor, my dean had this brilliant idea to offer a whiteness studies course, and he knew that I studied some of my research is on whiteness. And so he asked me to offer a whiteness studies course for the first time. And I taught it for about 6 years before I became a department chair. And it was, super intense. Initially, the faculty were kind of like, whatever, Amy, that wacky assistant professor is teaching the course on whiteness. I don't know why she has to. We already talk about, the whole university is already doing whiteness studies, and we already talked about white supremacy in our classroom, right? So that was what sort of the faculty in the College of Ethnic Studies who were dismissive of the classes I was teaching were saying. But I was also the first queer studies hire in the College of Ethnic Studies, so it didn't really matter to me what the faculty were saying. As long as I still had my job, I was pretty happy. But what really happened that was disruptive was that it hit the news. It went on the news that the College of Ethnic Studies was teaching a whiteness studies class. And all these white supremacists sort of crawled out of the woodwork, started emailing me, demanding that they come to my class, also sending me death threats, right? And that was pretty disruptive. So I decided to not let the news come to our, talk about our class anymore. And I continued to offer the class. The class was actually really inspiring. It was the first time that I would have a class with more than 30% white students. So the class was probably like 60% white students, which at first was kind of weird and exhausting for me. But they were the students were absolutely wonderful, meaning like, if you're a white supremacist, you're not going to take the whiteness studies. Like the only students who are going to take the whiteness studies class are the folks who are really want to think about whiteness as a racial category. And so just having those kinds of conversations with those students was actually really interesting for me. I remember one time in class, a student said something and I responded perhaps in a way that I thought was more dismissive than I would have liked to have responded. And I immediately apologized to this guy. to this male student and said, "Oh, I didn't mean to be dismissive." And he responded with, "Hey, you're a white guy. You know, I don't take things you can say anything to me and I won't be hurt by it." And then the entire class sort of laughed. And so it was those kinds of interactions that were also fascinating to me.
Great. We have about 5 minutes left, and I just want to reassure those whose questions I'm not going to get to. I'm going to hold on to them and pass them on for the second part of the event today. But I do want to ask a couple of questions about pedagogy. So at UTSC, we have a particular commitment to community engagement and experiential learning. So there's some interest in that, particularly as a way for students to reconcile what might feel sometimes like a conflict between their identities as community members and their identities as students. So maybe you could start there and think about the experiential and engaged learning. And then I have another question about pedagogy before we finish.
Yeah, so we're super invested in experiential and engaged learning. Many of our majors, not just in the College of Ethnic Studies, but also outside the College of Ethnic Studies, have a CSL component where you have to take X number of units in what's called community service learning. We have a division in the university that vets nonprofits, in the Bay Area to make sure that they're safe for students to do work at, right? And our philosophy is that there is no distinction between identity of a student and identity of a community activist. The fact that you are an SF state student means that you're also a community activist. And we get the kind of students who want to be engaged in the community, which I suspect is the same for you folks as well. And so I think that while philosophically there could be a divide between student and activist identity in the same way that there is between academia and activism, right? We like to say in the College of Ethnic Studies that we think that's a false dichotomy, right? That we think that academia and activism go hand in hand. That academia grows out of activism, right? We see that in the founding of ethnic studies. And also activism grows out of academia. We see this in the case of Cesar Chavez, who is reading all this literature by liberation scholars, right? So I like to say that it's a false dichotomy, but at the same time, I know that it's a real sense of a division. And so I think that we have to work harder to reassure both students and faculty that they are both, that they can be both and that they are both.
Great. And I'll ask one last question, bringing together a few that have been posed here, to really think about in classroom practices and protocols, thinking about the relationships between teachers and students, among students. Are there any things that are distinctive about the College of Ethnic Studies pedagogical practices? And are there any supports or opportunities that you offer or would like to offer faculty or recommend we offer faculty who want to pursue anti-racist, inclusive pedagogical approaches?
Yeah, so I think that, we have a lot, it is not everyone. Obviously, we have some faculty who are hard asses and are like the immigrant mom that you never wanted, right? But most of our faculty generally are understanding of student delays. They kind of get that their students may be struggling because they themselves struggled as undergrads, right? Juggling commitments to family, work, things like that. And so things like, I think it's called contract grading, and maybe the panel after us can talk more about this, but things like contract grading, right? Also, during COVID, the suggestion has been to not make attendance a requirement. We make attendance a requirement, but we know that students may not have Wi-Fi or they might not have a bedroom of their own where they could come to class. So we do more flexible assignments, right? We also offer, you probably already do this, but you can do a CSL project instead of a paper for your student assignment, right? That's that.
And CSL is community service learning.
Mm-hmm. So it's that community engaged. It's like writing a paper for the internship instead of writing a paper for the class, right? Or doing a presentation about your community project, right? So that kind of flexibility, I think, is really important. Also, a lot of our faculty do assignments like interview your grandmother or do oral history, right? So that students can feel connected with their background, with their roots, with the kind of movement that has already been going on long before them. I am a historian, so I'm an advocate of history being very empowering to students, right? but also other faculty who are not historians are having students, do interviews, oral histories. We also have faculty who are doing, having their students make short YouTube videos, which is very apt for this, to talk about sort of their, something that's important to them in terms of their identity or their community, right? So that's something else. We have a whole bunch of classes in our first year experience that have, it's not we, meaning this is actually the university has a whole bunch of classes. They've started a whole bunch of classes that have the word me in it, like social movements and me. and I think it's this younger generation, like if there's me in it, they're super excited about it and it feels relevant to them. And relevant education is a high impact practice that is inclusive, right? It's not alienating, right? So those are some other things. There was another question that you had asked me in that question, Jessica, which I wanted to answer. Do you remember?
Yeah, just briefly, if you could speak to professional development support and.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So one example is we noticed one of the 7 high impact practices that we were weak on was faculty research projects that students could be involved in. Not student research projects, but faculty research projects that students could be involved in a publication or something. And so we rolled out what's called FURIES, which are faculty undergraduate research initiative. They're like little mini grants. And we give faculty something like $2,000 that they can give, or even $1,000 that they can give their student to work on a project that the faculty member is working on towards a publication. And then if the faculty member chooses, they can put the student down as a co-author. I think, Jessica, you did stuff like that at State, right? Yeah. So that's something that we encourage. And we know that our faculty are super tired and may not be thinking of mentoring undergrads. And we also know that our undergrads may not have the money to take on this extra work, right, on the side. And so we're trying to give money to students to consider it like a job to help faculty on a research project. Asian American Studies, they have an internship program where students can get credit for being an intern at a community org, but they're also giving their student interns, an extra $200. So that's another way to encourage more students to then engage in these kinds of curricular things that will also be helpful for them in terms of their engagement in higher ed.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And again, I want you to fill your ears with all of the virtual applause moving around the Zoom call and all of the appreciation I've been seeing in the chat as we've been listening to your talk and then your Q&A, Amy. We're going to take a break and come back for a panel discussion in which our colleagues from UTSC will engage with the ideas that Professor Tsuyoshi has shared with us, and Professor Larson will facilitate that conversation. So we're going to take a break. We will be back at 2:30, so we have just under 10 minutes here. Your people are welcome to leave their Zoom link on if that's helpful for you with your technology, or you can just use the link that you had to enter the seminar initially. Look forward to seeing many of you when we return. And thank you so much, Amy, Professor Tsuyoshi, for your time with us today.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll see you all in just under 10 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. At this point, we'll be picking up some of the threads that emerged in Dean Tsuyoshi presentation and that we were exploring further in the Q&A, but interweaving that now with the UTSC and broader University of Toronto context. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce 3 faculty members who will be providing brief responses and reflections today. Aarti Ashok is a professor teaching stream and associate chair undergraduate affairs in the Department of Biological Sciences at UTSC. Her current pedagogical research projects explore student learning in the context of community-based experiential assignments and examine student attitudes and experiences in active learning classrooms as a part of a cross-disciplinary educator group. Aarti's student-centered learning approaches have been recognized by several awards, including the 2020 University of Toronto President's Teaching Award. Dani Kwan Lafond is an assistant professor teaching stream in the Department of Sociology at UTSC. Her teaching practice includes community-engaged projects, land-based learning, and trauma-informed education. Dani was formerly the coordinator of the Indigenous Studies Certificate Program at Centennial College, where she helped create a free online e-textbook available to all learners in Canada. Lance McCready is an associate professor in the Department of Leadership, Adult and Higher Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. His current research focuses on the educational trajectories of young Black men in Canadian urban centres and programs and services for ethnic and racial minority males who are underrepresented in North American colleges and universities. Lance is interested in the ways that intersectionality, social determinants of health, and gender relations frameworks can be mobilized to develop effective programs that promote academic achievement, well-being, school engagement, and access to higher education. So each of our presenters will be speaking briefly for up to 6 minutes each, and we'll hear from them in turn before opening it up to Q&A and discussion. If you have questions that emerge as we're listening to the presentations, feel free to input those into the Q&A box as we go. And I'll also do my best to interweave questions that we weren't able to respond to in the earlier part of the session. We have asked the faculty presenters to reflect on key questions and larger issues from Professor Tsuyoshi's presentation that might be taken up further, and how the points raised in the seminar presentation and the broader question of inclusive curriculum design connect to our context at UTSC and U of T, as well as their individual teaching experience. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Ashok to begin.
Thank you very much, Katie. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to join this panel and contribute to the discussion on building a more inclusive curriculum. As Katie mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Biological Sciences, and I've been there for 11 years and had the absolute privilege of working with diverse and exceptional students at UTSC. I've had a lot of fun designing assignments where students learn from each other, but also from partners in the community. But what I'm not is a scholar of curricular reform. Nonetheless, I hope I can present views that are shared by colleagues who all seek to foster success of all students, including those from equity deserving groups. So what I'll do is make 3 points here, connecting each to Amy's paper and presentation and providing an invitation for further discussion in the process. So I've seen students who have successfully become physicians complete training in public health and embark on the long journey towards an academic position. I've also seen many who've had exceptional careers outside of their training in biology, working as leaders in law and political think tanks and in graphic design. And from those alumni that I hear back from, typically over the holidays, there's one theme that stands out. They remember the community that they built in their courses with individuals that dared them to think differently. And as an example, there's a group of students who met for the first time in my 4th year course and freely admitted that it was because they were so different from each other that their group outreach assignment was a success. 4 years since graduation, they still meet up every summer when they come to visit their families in Toronto. And they get together for a group 7 barbecue, and they were group 7 in the outreach assignment in my course. I bring this up as an example of what students often value years beyond their undergraduate tenure, experiences in which they found meaningful connection within a diverse group when they felt they had gained something of value outside of their classroom and tests to local communities. And I'm sure many of you have such stories. Interestingly, Amy describes survey results from her campus in which many students state that a sense of connection might be an important means of improving student retention. And that brings me to my first point, enabling learning in the context of our local and diverse communities. In my 4th year course, which is entitled Pathobiology of Human Disease, student groups deliver an hour workshop in local high schools, early learning centers, public libraries, or retirement communities. And most of their learning is in areas relevant to our course content, but it also requires them to explore areas that address the needs of our community partners. As an example, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, a student group delivered a workshop on brain health to a group of 40 highly diverse and highly engaged seniors who tested the students' knowledge of all types and stages of dementia. We met a retired nurse who had worked with World War II veterans and could tell us a lot about caring for those with post-traumatic stress. Students truly broadened their horizons in every community context because they were ready to listen and learn. Congruently, Amy describes the effectiveness of the ethnic studies curriculum that embeds in community projects so as to showcase academia as by necessity engaged in the external world around them. UTSC has significant strengths in experiential learning, and our continued expansion of such opportunities for students would serve to further reinforce the value of students' academic learning instead of disengaging from it. In particular, I would advocate for explicitly communicating development of intercultural competency as one of the main goals of such learning opportunities. And I'd like to invite attendees to share their visions for community-based learning. Second, providing opportunities for students to become the voices of reason or change that we'd like to see in the world. To illustrate this, I'd like to share with you outstanding student work from a 2nd year, 500 student foundation course in cell biology. The assignment is entitled Activism in Biology, in which student groups created digital murals to highlight the importance of questioning stereotypes and prejudices in science and medicine. I'm going to share with you here 2 examples. This first one highlights the importance of appropriate training for healthcare professionals that will dispel racial bias and myths that have no basis in biology. And the groups here particularly refer to racial discrimination in the area of pain assessments and the positive outcomes that could be manifested if we were to engage in appropriate training for this group. The second example here advocates for the rights of intersex individuals, defined in the medical literature as imperfect sexual differentiation into biologically male or female. Specifically, these students advocate for the rights of intersex individuals to medical autonomy as an important aspect of inclusion. And these are some examples in which student voices inspire and inform us on equity and inclusion as part of the curriculum. I recently read an interview with Valentina Turb-Lagrave, who is a director of inclusive teaching practices at the University of Denver, in which she advises all instructors to interrogate their disciplines critically. She says, "My point is, you don't need to make teaching about racism an add-on to any course. Exploring how it's embedded in the curriculum, what constitutes the canon, and who's in the room ensures that conversations traverse students' critical understanding of how race and privilege impact them in real time." And I have no doubt that both Amy and those attending have significant expertise to be able to speak to this idea, and I'd really welcome both. And finally, creating space for personal dialogues on race and equity in the classroom. Many colleagues have expressed both need and difficulty to open such conversations with students in STEM classrooms, and I'm no exception. We feel ill-equipped to moderate such discussions, but inaction on our part will only ensure that we don't understand and hence do not remove barriers for our students. It also emphasizes the importance of faculty remaining open to learning from their students, who may often bring valuable perspectives and life experiences vastly different from their own. Learning to structure conversations on those topics in any discipline could be a call to action that aligns with the goals of the Curriculum Review Working Circle at UTSC, and I'd welcome your thoughts on this. Perhaps the most fundamental takeaway from these points of discussion is the importance of building a collaborative resolve among educators for an inclusive curriculum. And I'm going to draw on Amy's beautiful words for this. Broad faculty insistence towards a greater social good, rather than advancing personal or departmental glory, remains essential in creating a culture that commands student-centered higher education in its most revolutionary form. So thank you, Amy, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Arthi. Professor Kwan Lafond, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here to talk about these things because it's my work and I love engaging in these kinds of conversations. I'm hoping to just offer some reflections about, I'm thinking about how to apply kind of the principles and ideas about ethnic studies, which I love that Dr. Tsuyoshi started by saying is not actually about studying ethnic groups per se, but it's about studying power, right? And so in my work, I teach a course on the TRC and I teach a course on social inequality, both one totally indigenous and one indigenized largely. And so again, it's about thinking about, for my students who come in expecting to hear facts and figures about, I don't know, treaties or something, that we're really going to study power and colonialism. And so I think that what I took from Dr. Tsuyoshi's paper and the kind of review of ethnic studies is that the reason it works is kind of themes of, and I'm rephrasing here, but connection, both in terms of seeing yourself reflected in faculty, in literature, in the community that the program is set in, but also about representation. And Dr. Tsuyoshi, you didn't use this word, but I thought a lot about kindness and just the kindness that seems to be embedded in the program and in faculty-student relations. So these are things that inform my work and that I think about lots, and I hope that I can offer some links here. So as most of you know, at UTSC, we have very diverse students. And with respect to teaching Indigenous studies, which is something that institutionally we're all thinking about, we have very few Indigenous students, and I very rarely actually have Indigenous students in my classroom. So I'm thinking a lot in my work about how to teach Indigenous content in a way that engages students, which means I need them to care. And to be frank, I've had the experience of many students, mostly not white settler students, but first and second generation racialized students who come into the class with quite a bit of hesitancy because they know that they don't know. And so they're feeling off and they're also not connected with the knowledge. So I'm thinking about how to do that and how to get them to engage. So for example, we talk about colonialism and the foundation of this country being white supremacy and anti-Indigenous interventions into life. And so there's always two ways of doing that. So I think about the study of our history in this country, but then also about how the students can think about themselves. And so Dr. Tsuyoshi, when you said, and me, and I'm thinking I should rename this course like the TRC and me, because I really do get the students to do a lot of self-reflection. So they have to think about also their own relationship to colonialism. And we've had the most interesting and rich discussions in the class about particularly British colonialism, right? So as a former British Commonwealth country, so Canada has a lot of similarities with other countries in the world that have been colonized by Britain. And from the language that we speak to our educational systems, to all of that. And so thinking about how we can connect with topics in indigeneity, but relate it to who the students are and to honor their own lived experiences and the experiences that they have without saying that they have to be experts in this knowledge or that they also have to somehow feel guilty, which is a big barrier. And we always have those discussions in class. And so with respect to that, I'll wrap it up just with a couple of thoughts, which is that I encourage us all to learn with our students. none of us necessarily are experts. I'm not an expert in Indigenous history and knowledge. I try to keep it local because it makes that job more feasible and smaller. So to relay the local history, but to also admit that like our students, the institutions that brought me up didn't do a great job of including my history or Indigenous history or anything that the students may have as personal stories. And so we don't have to be experts with respect to that stuff. So I've done a lot of learning with students where we've looked up treaties and stories together. My second thought is just teaching excellence. And so Dr. Tsuyoshi talked about the tendency towards teaching victimhood. I think that, in Canada, with respect to Indigenous stories, a lot of what we hear are the negatives, but there are so many excellent, at this university, there are so many excellent people. We don't have to look far to teach excellence. So I try to bring those stories out. And then the last thing is the idea of nothing about us without us, which actually comes from disability studies. But I think about ways to incorporate community, and with respect to Indigenous communities, sometimes that means volunteer projects for the students so that they can kind of appropriately create community relations without taking on too much. So yeah, I welcome further discussion. I'm conscious of time, and we'll stop there for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny. Professor McCready, over to you.
I think my video has been stopped. I can't start it by the host. Okay, okay, there we go. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being asked to participate on this panel. And I know that we did a land acknowledgement. I also just want to acknowledge that this software that we're using, Zoom, is the headquarters of Zoom is in San Jose, which was the territory stewarded by the Mukwek Ohlone tribal nation. And we're able to connect via Zoom because of the worries and the work that they have done to preserve the lands and waters that carry our images. I also just want to acknowledge a graduate student, Tanitia Monroe, who made this wonderful sweatshirt that I'm wearing featuring the lyrics of Sweet Honey in the Rock. I don't know, but I'm laughing out loud. I believe together we can make a change. And I speak to you this afternoon as a US educated social sciences scholar. Introduced to ethnic studies while a graduate student at UC Berkeley, introduced to queer color critique from ethnic studies scholar Evelyn Nakano Glenn. I often find myself caught between the language of ethnic studies and diaspora studies in Canada, and ethnic studies, equity studies and diaspora studies in Canada, and ethnic studies in the United States. I also feel caught between approaches to empirical research and quantitative reasoning within the US ethnic studies frame and the critique of quantitative research in the Canadian equity studies frame. I want to draw some historical and contemporary connections between ethnic studies movement in the United States and 3 efforts in Ontario, the Black Heritage Programs, Afrocentric Alternative School and the Toronto District School Board, and the Transitional Year Program at University of Toronto, for which I'm the director. And this year, we have a new cohort of the Transitional Year Program at the UT Scarborough campus. All 3 Ontario programs, like ethnic studies, use a critical, culturally grounded, culturally relevant curriculum to improve academic outcomes. So just briefly, the Black Cultural Heritage Programs and the Afrocentric Alternative School and Toronto District School Board, the heritage programs were actually started in 1975 by the Black Education Project. They're obviously several decades old within the school boards of Toronto, York, and North York. And these were programs that were funded by the Black Cultural Heritage Programs from continuing education grants. The Afrocentric Alternative School has been open since 2009, and that sort of opened as a response to a community request from the school board in 2007 to establish a school because of the high dropout rate and achievement gap affecting students of African descent. The TDSB initiated a consultation process in 2008, and that led to the establishment of the school opening in September 2009. And then I also want to point out the transitional year program here at University of Toronto. It's intended for adults who don't have formal qualifications for university admissions. The program has its roots in the Black community in Toronto, having emerged out of two community summer programs in 1969 and 1970, which served to prepare a small number of students for entry to York University. The first of these were housed in the Home Service Association on Bathurst Street, and later sort of moved to University of Toronto. So like ethnic studies in the United States, the Black Cultural Heritage Programs, Afrocentric Alternative School in the Toronto District School Board and the Transitional Year Program at University of Toronto have different critically conscious ideological origins. They have a curriculum that is unique, and it's autonomous from sort of the mainstream, quote unquote, Toronto District School Board academic programs, maybe more akin like the alternative school programs that exist within the Toronto District School Board. So my big question is, I was really taken by this question that Dr. Tsuyoshi asked about, programs being at the periphery, at the center. Do we need to make these programs like the Afrocentric Alternative Program, like the Black Cultural Heritage Programs in the TDSB, or like the Transitional Year Program at University of Toronto that exists largely outside of the whole sort of recruitment admissions mechanisms of the first entry divisions like UTSC and like the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at St. George? Do we need to bring these and make these types of programs more central? Do they need to be a requirement like the ethnic studies in the San Francisco State University? Is this the path that we need to take to advance the well-being and empowerment of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Canada? Is this what we need to do for the collective good for University of Toronto and more broadly Canadian society? And that's, I'm just going to end with those questions.
Thank you so much, Lance. Really important questions on which to end. At this point, I'd like to invite all of our panelists and Dr. Tsuyoshi as well to join us in this virtual circle. To begin, a reminder to folks in the audience to please bring your questions in writing through the Q&A function. You can address a question to an individual panelist or to the panel as a whole. And while those questions start to come in, I want to turn it first to Dr. Tsuyoshi to respond to some of the reflections and questions that have been raised by our three panelists.
So I just want to say that I'm so moved to hear about all these different programs and initiatives and classroom innovations that you folks are all involved in. I was moved, Arti, by all that you're doing in the classroom, particularly with the sciences. I think it's really difficult for people to think about science pedagogy or the science classroom as a place where people can engage in issues of race and social justice and equity, things that you talked about. And I think your call to faculty in the STEM fields to still engage in it, and the ways in which you do it creatively and productively are incredibly inspiring. So thank you for that. And I think that others who are viewing right now are probably going to hit you up for more ideas on what to do. I definitely wanted to be a part of that Group 7 barbecue as well. So it's also remarkable that in such a competitive STEM classroom that you can also create community, right? Like I've heard that at UC Berkeley that the science students go in and they throw books out the window so their classmates can't access them when they have to study for an exam. So really congrats to you for doing that. Danny, I was really also moved by how you're thinking about structuring your course, not just for Native students, Indigenous students, right? As other students come into the classroom. I thought it was particularly fascinating that you're thinking about how to engage other racialized students who are coming into your classroom, who also know that they don't know anything and are a little bit, have some trepidation about being there because they probably feel like maybe they shouldn't even belong there, that space should be for Native students, right? So they're coming both out of respect, nerves, and curiosity, right? So that to me is incredible. And I appreciated how you talked about drawing from disability studies to think about your curriculum. In our college, our areas of weakness in terms of diversity are with disabled faculty and students, as well as queer faculty and students. And so we're also trying to run a disability reading work group for the faculty in the spring, and hopefully get a class on race and disability that then we're hoping we can also put in the sciences, in the science GE. I don't know if all that will come true, but I appreciated the fact that you're bringing all these different fields into the classroom. We're also facing, our American Indian Studies department also has probably the most non-native white students who come to the classroom. And so they've been dealing with the fact that their students are not majority Indigenous. But I don't know if they've thought about, what that means in terms of their pedagogy as consciously as you have. So I was inspired by that. And I wondered also if I might talk to the chair about the kinds of things that you're doing. Notably, our Africana Studies department is also deciding that they need to figure out classroom curriculum that can build allies and coalitions, as they find that they may not have the concentration of Black students to fill all their classes. What I recently realized from my Vice President of Student Affairs and Enrollment Management was that our university in its long history has done nothing to recruit Native students. And so I recommend that you talk to whoever you can. You don't have to do it. I don't want you to go out and figure this all out, but you should talk to your VP of Student Affairs and get the university on board with recruiting Native students. I think that would be super important and valuable. So thanks for that. Lance, I loved all the work that you're involved in outside of the university, right? Thinking about basically how all these Black liberation movements are informing students, encouraging them to continue with school and think about education as a place where they belong. Obviously, that the College of Ethnic Studies and myself were fans of any kind of liberation movement and cultural nationalist programs. So I think that's fantastic. I want to tell the university, if they're not already doing this is UTSC, that they should continue to support all of these community engagements, ways to think about curriculum in an innovative way, that you shouldn't have to be doing this alone, that Lance, your work outside the university, your involvement with these different groups, such as the Black Cultural Heritage Program, the Afrocentric Alternative School, as well as the Transitional Year Program, should all be seen as part of your professional achievement and contribution to the university. And there should be a systemic way to recognize you both for the work and also a systemic way to continue to encourage you to do the innovative work that you do. If whether that's innovation grants from faculty affairs is what we would call it, right, in our university, but you're from your professional development arm in your division. Regarding Lance, your specific question about requirement, I don't know how difficult it is to add a requirement to your campus or to your institution. I think that many institutions actually go the route of getting sort of, a requirement, an ethnic studies requirement into the curriculum. But what we've seen to be most successful at San Francisco State is to just put ethnic studies everywhere. Like put it in every single requirement at the university. And that is harder to do if you don't have, a critical mass of faculty. But I also want to encourage you to feel like you can teach classes that you may not have been trained in, right? So not to say that you should, I don't want to say that, like, I'm not saying that all the English PhDs should start teaching all the sociology classes. But what I'm saying is that, like, if there's an area that's not being taught and there's no one on campus that can really teach it, right? That, faculty should not feel afraid to kind of venture into a new area of teaching if it means increasing inclusivity and accessibility at campus. And I'm thinking specifically about what Arti said about how STEM faculty might find it hard to talk about race, to bring issues of inclusivity, social justice, equity, and access into the classroom, but they should still venture to do that. And so in that way, I know that for our College of Ethnic Studies, sometimes we lose a historian because they go to a different institution, but we don't stop teaching the history classes. We have another faculty member teach it. And it may not be as rigorous as a historian teaching it, but the point is that we just want to give students curriculum that they can engage in and feel a part of. So I want to congratulate all three of you. And then I want to encourage UTSC to continue to support you administratively as much as they can by getting you more students to successfully pass through your institution, and also supporting you as scholars and activists in doing the work that you love and care about.
Thank you so much. A number of I want to pull together a number of comments that are emerging here. One, the responsibility that all of us have, and this came up in Arti's remarks about interrogating our disciplines and thinking critically about existing disciplinary frameworks, but then also how curriculum connects to and intersects with so many other areas of the institution. And Lance, your comments about both the educational pathways that students are coming from as they come into higher education, and then the various ways in which students require support once they are there, and Amy, your comments about student well-being and the care. Danny used the word kindness that is needed to foster that support. So my question is really about and this is a question that reflects a couple that have come up in the Q&A feed as well. How members of the university who may not be in the classroom teaching, so staff members, librarians, student support services, how you see these crucial supports for students who may be engaging in mentoring conversations with students, in dialogue with them about particular projects that they're working on, pointing them to resources, pointing them to bursary opportunities. I'd be curious to hear how some examples of models where you've seen that working really well, or that where that has really enriched your own teaching, and also more broadly how those different institutional connections can inform curriculum and pedagogy.
There's something that you're helping to crystallize around the whole question of supports. And I just want to put it out there. Maybe it's just me. I feel like right now there is a lot more attention to and language for providing sort of academic supports, mental health supports for students of color at University of Toronto. And there is less attention to ethnic studies curriculum, the actual classes. So We're trying to figure out how to reduce barriers and provide social supports and financial supports and all of these different supports to students, but there is less, arguably, attention to us hiring faculty that are going to teach Indigenous studies courses in like across the departments, or really being able to have as a goal that we do not want any of our students graduating from University of Toronto unless they have taken some sort of ethnic studies or equity studies sort of course. You know, we don't, and it doesn't have to be in the equity studies department. It can be in bio, it can be in, you know, music, it can be in, we don't care. So that's something that I'm trying to wrap my head around, at the same time, which I'm very aware as the director of the transitional year program, that part of what facilitates students from sort of quote unquote less privileged or underrepresented groups to matriculate to sort of faculty arts and sciences is the amount and the web of supports that we try to wrap those students in order for them to sort of get what they need, get the skills, get the dispositions, get the critical consciousness to sort of make it in Faculty of Arts and Sciences. But it's one of those things where I feel really on the fence about. Sorry for taking, but it took me a while to articulate that.
If I could just quickly add to what Lance just said, we actually did a study on our campus with this is something called the Stupski grant. And we found that the greatest factor of retention was actually a faculty member. So it's, you know, all the student support is in fact important, which is what we realized, because we had no, you know, student affairs side. We had very little support, even though we had this enormous College of Ethnic Studies. But we realized also through this grant, which we just completed last year, that the students were saying that the faculty were the most impactful around whether they stayed in school or not. It wasn't whether financial aid went easily or not. It wasn't whether there was a student resource center on campus. They all listed faculty. So it could be something that UT thinks about as well in terms of how important it is to invest in curriculum that is equity-minded.
And curriculum and hiring as well, the two.
Yes, curriculum and hiring both go together, yeah, for sure.
But this also, I want to bring in a comment that came up earlier in relation to and Artie gave the example of STEM faculty, but there are faculty in other disciplines as well who are very interested and committed to this work, but are hesitant or fearful about undertaking it and worried about doing it in a way that is not, especially, and I'm thinking not just in terms of curricular development, but also more broadly thinking through inclusive and anti-racist pedagogical frameworks. So one of the questions that has come in the Q&A, how would you advise faculty who are interested in engaging in this work, but find themselves overwhelmed by the different frameworks and lenses, and how might that complement dedicated curricular development that finds a balance between the kind of focused approach that the College of Ethnic Studies offers as a model, and the importance of embedding this work across programs and across pedagogical supports.
So I'll answer really quickly, and then I'm hoping other folks on the panel will answer. But as I mentioned before, like our weakness is using sort of disability studies and queer studies as a pedagogical frame. And so what we started doing just last year because of COVID and all the remote learning, we started running remote teaching workshops for our faculty. We do it once during the summer, once during the winter. And the faculty member who's teaching it, she teaches it remotely. And we give her $1,500 to run the workshop. And it's like 4 meetings, an hour each. And she uses a disability frame. She shows faculty how to put a disability studies frame into the class to make it more accessible. And then the faculty who are in the workshop then can take little tidbits of whatever they've learned in that workshop and incorporate into their class. So obviously you don't have to come out the gate ready, teaching equity and ethnic studies like full blast, right? But you can learn little, tricks and tools and little techniques, right? And slowly incorporate it. And I would recommend, if you folks aren't already doing it, to have training workshops to enable faculty to do that and to compensate the faculty member teaching those workshops.
Yeah, Arthi, go ahead.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the point that Amy just made. I think sort of an incremental start in terms of making, sort of small introductions into your pedagogy that go towards this type of activism or opening conversations in this area go a long way to getting started. But I agree that, and one of the reasons I raised that point in particular was to sort of signal that an institution-wide sort of support, training, sharing amongst departments and colleagues is going to be kind of a critical move towards getting those that I know are incredibly eager and interested in investing energy in this process, but perhaps don't yet have the right motivations or the support network. We talk a lot about support networks for supporting our students, but I think similar networks need to exist for faculty as well if they're going to take this on and be able to pass those benefits on to the students. So creating that network and sort of a professional development sort of community of practice, so to speak, would be very beneficial in this for this particular problem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that another institution I used to work at is Carleton College in Minnesota, which is a liberal arts college. They don't have as many liberal arts colleges here in Canada. There are some, but not very many. But they had sort of a quantitative reasoning workshop for faculty over the summer where they would give us a stipend. We could bring a course or an idea, and we would basically figure out how to build in quantitative reasoning to it. And we would come together, once a week or every 2 weeks. We created sort of a network. We were across all the different disciplines. It didn't matter sort of what discipline you were coming from. And I always thought that was an amazing way to sort of build a community and a network of folks that were sort of trying to sort of accomplish something. And it was more critical quantitative work. Not all of us were sort of doing statistical analyses. Some of us were just focusing on the reasoning aspect of it. But so it became a really nice way. So I would like to see University of Toronto offer more of those types of workshops, maybe in the vein of, again, I don't know how you want to frame it, sort of equity studies, critical ethics studies, anti-colonialism, I don't know, but like let's do that. Maybe summer's not a bad time for us to do that. And I don't know, it's not really in the culture here, but offer faculty a stipend. Like, it doesn't even have to be a lot, like even, 500, 1,000 or something, just acknowledges that. I don't know.
Danny.
Hi, just a couple of quick thoughts, kind of picking up on what colleagues have said here. So Lance, when you mentioned just student supports and student well-being, so something I think about and that I wanted to ask Dr. Tsuyoshi about what that looks like in your institution is that it has been my institutional experience that the human care workers in our institution are not as diverse as the faculty. And I've had the experience of having particularly Indigenous students come to, and where I'm actually a social worker by background. So to some degree, they come to me more, I think, for that. But it's a part of my life that I try to draw boundaries around. I'm like, I'm not your social worker, but we have social workers and counselors. However, they've come back, and this has happened like many times in my career. And they've said, yeah, but they have no idea. They can't even pronounce my nation name. Like they asked me what country I was from, and I said Anishinaabe, or they have no idea about my culture, and I'm educating them. And so the racialized counselors have long lists you know, waiting lists, and it was just harder. So I'm thinking about, you know, that we do that caring work, and it's work that I take really seriously, and you know, profs did that for me, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And yet I also think about the other, like those partners in our institutions, and how, you know, when we send students off for care, what does that look like, and how do we, yeah, what do we do with that? And I have no answers, just questions. And I'm new to UTSC, so I'm not saying that this is a problem I've encountered here either. Just that it's something I'm conscious of, and students have already asked me, like, yeah, I want to go, but do you know if there's anybody Native working there? And I, you know, I don't know. I can find out. So just thinking about student well-being and our partners, and I see the question there in terms of librarians and campus partners. And then what I wanted to say on that, and I'll keep it very brief, is to build relationships. So for example, there is an Indigenous librarian who I know through other circles, who's now downtown campus, but I'll have her pop into my class to talk to students about how to research residential schools, or, you know, which can be really tricky, which starts a relationship. And then maybe in a year, we can do something collaborative. I think with respect to equity and EDI, it can be really touchy. So I also think, yeah, I want to know folks, you know, we want to build relationships within our institutions before we do that, you know, heavy work, I guess. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
And I think that also speaks to the role that librarians and community partners can play in shaping curriculum and contributing to curriculum, as well as supporting faculty. I want to bring students back into this as well, and in particular student knowledges. And all of you in different ways spoke to, and Danny in particular talked about the experience of learning with students, and how assessment design, assignment design, recognition of the experiences and knowledges that students are bringing with them into the classroom. How do these elements challenge our usual notions of teaching? And then more broadly, how, I'm thinking about how they bump up against standard assessment frameworks or expectations around or assumptions about assignment design. This also connects back to a question that came up in the earlier panel about the relationship between top down and ground up. And certainly we're in a moment where we're hearing very much from students and community partners about an institutional accountability to these questions, magnified in many ways as a result of the pandemic, although by no means new. So can you talk more about how student knowledges can not only be formally incorporated into classroom practice, pedagogical practice, curriculum, but also how that in turn transforms our institutional understandings of teaching? Would anyone like to go ahead, Danny? Yeah, so I'm thinking about land as the first, you know, so they walk into my class and I say, we're going to talk about land. And then students struggle with that because as overwhelmingly urban students, they're connected to things like community centers and places. Whether that's about land is really tough. So I think, so I asked them to think about a time when you were really like zen with land. Where was it? What was that? You know, it's kind of a fun exercise, and it's their lived experience, right? And so then once we've got that piece, then I can ask more difficult questions. So what's the story of that land? Who was there before? You know, can they do some undigging? And also as a foundational concept that, you know, we all have land acknowledgements in our course outlines as teaching tools. We can unpack those things. And again, we can learn them with our students. If we don't know the words in there, there's nothing, you know, embarrassing. I hope there shouldn't be, you know, we didn't write them personally, and none of us were taught in our own, you know, institutional experiences. So I also try to, you know, for students to think about keeping the critiques systemic and institutional too, because as they're bringing themselves into the classroom, it can be really easy to individualize, right? Blame and guilt and responsibility. And so then I ask them to question, well, think about the institutions that you went to. And what did you learn about yourself, let alone Indigenous folks? Where's your history?
And then they can bring in, their own perhaps less than great experiences with education, but it allows them a lens that then, we can then jump to talking about other things that are not their experiences. So it has to, at least in my like limited field, which is, I recognize doesn't apply to everybody. It has to start with them, because otherwise it's really hard to get them to care, and they don't engage if they don't care often, I'll say.
Yeah, Arthi.
Yeah, sure. I really love the way Danny framed that, and I would entirely agree with that point of kind of starting from where the students want to be, and kind of bringing their connection and their curiosity into everything that surrounds pedagogy. So the two assignments that I showed as part of kind of my comments earlier, the assignment design itself came from ideas that I had discussed with graduate students who served as my teaching assistants for the course. So it was actually, the entire design of it was with students. And then the undergraduate students each brought their own thoughts and ideas into what types of activism they were curious about, or they wanted to know more about, or where they wanted to explore the biology literature and how it connected to some of the social justice questions that were top of mind for them. So a lot of it came out of their own connection and curiosity to what they want to know more about. And I think that is a great place to begin exploring these discussions, because it's really insightful to me as an instructor as well. So I'm hoping that that also calls into question the sort of classical power dynamics that might exist in a classroom, where it's very much the instructor that dictates the tone or the direction of an assignment, but that sort of turns it around and says that I'm accepting where the students would like to go with this assignment, and I'm here to support that learning rather than dictating the kind of tone of it.
Just to build on that, I always sort of, one of my general frameworks for teaching is that I try to design a balance of different assignments and assessments, build those into the class, and they're ones that are sort of building on how Arti described that. It's some are Lance driven. They're sort of about me, and like, I want you to know these things that I've taught. And there's usually for me like some sort of praxis or culminating assignment that's actually not driven by me, but it's more about what they learn and what they're bringing and how, and I usually allow some flexibility to take it in whatever direction they want to take it. And I develop some sort of general frameworks for assessment that aren't so tied to always particular forms, but could go across sort of different sort of forms. In other words, some students might want to do sort of an amazing presentation that they plan to do in a community setting, and other people might want to do some more of an academic paper, and some people might want to do like a, so, but I think that it's really important to sort of build in a variety of assessments, and some that are sort of really driven specifically around assessing the content that you want students to know, and others that allow them to really take the insights in direction that's meaningful for them. And usually the assessment for that is not going to be a test. It's usually going to have to be something more project-based or something more.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic context that we're in, I think has underscored the importance of flexibility and flexible assessment design in new ways as well. We have time for one more question, and I want to sort of pan outwards again to the institutional picture. The classroom is one of the places where, you know, as we all know, institutions can take a while to change, although I feel like we're in a moment that has shown that institutions can also move very quickly when they want to. And COVID, I think one of the silver linings for me is a recognition that that institutional change can happen. It does, obviously, it bumps up against systemic processes that can take time to shift. But change and rapid change and tangible action is possible. And the classroom for me is one of the places where change can happen in very meaningful ways, and can begin right away, and can also then put pressure and interrogate broader systemic structures. The question that I want to end with is how, given that we are very much in an institutional context where UTSC and the University of Toronto as a whole wants to support this work and encourage it and advocate for it, how the question is directed specifically to Dean Tsuyoshi, but I'd welcome other panelists' comments as well. How institutional offices can broaden programming supports and approaches to curriculum design and pedagogy to better address the issues and that have been raised today. And it's interesting, there are differences between our institutional context and San Francisco State, but there are also parallels in that University of Toronto is a multi-divisional university where there are local demographic and program specific needs and strengths, but there's also a connection between those divisional initiatives and a broader institutional tri-campus framework. So in aligning that on the ground work that is happening in the classrooms and supporting faculty that want to undertake this work, supporting departments, how can the institution as a whole help to advance that work?
Sure. So, San Francisco State is part of a larger CSU system. It's California State University system. There's 23 campuses within the system. And our chancellor, he's the top guy of all 23 campuses. The previous chancellor, he just retired like a few months ago. He rolled out something called a GI 2025, which is Graduation Initiative 2025. And it's to improve graduation retention rates for students across the 23 campuses and also reduce the opportunity gap, like to narrow the opportunity gap. And he actually gave all the campuses a little bit of money to work on improving graduation retention rates. And then our Division of Undergrad Education Academic Planning rolled out a series of programs based on this fund. We also got COVID CARES money, right? That we were supposed to direct towards enhanced teaching as we went remote, right? And so our campus, because we're a UMI, which is an MSI, which is a minority serving institution, we also got more money than some other institutions in the US. And we rolled out a number of programs with that. So let me just go over a few of the things that we rolled out. One is that we, with the GI 2025 funding, our DUAP, which is the Division of Undergrad Education and Academic Planning, they ran an application for programs to develop certificates and minors that increase student engagement and retention. So we know that identity-based minors actually increase retention, right? So we rolled out like a Latino health undergrad certificate that we're doing in collaboration with Science and Engineering, College of Science and Engineering. We also rolled out some equity education undergrad certificates, right, around race and education that we're doing with sociology and also education as well, right? Now with the COVID money that came in to improve teaching on our campus for our students who are typically under-resourced, we started something called JEDI, which is a training program, basically, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It's a JEDI training program for all of our faculty across the university, and they learn teaching techniques around creating a more inclusive, equity-oriented, justice-oriented pedagogy. And we actually, it's cohorted. You can take an online class, that's one option, and you can also be in a cohorted class. So there's different platforms for this JEDI, and the money goes to both the instructors who enroll in the class. This is what Lance was talking about, right? I think they do give them something like $500 for the students to enroll, not students, the faculty to enroll in these workshops. And then they also gave a faculty member course release to design the JEDI curriculum with we have this division called that talks about that helps with improved teaching. It's like I can't remember the name of it now, I'm blanking on it, but it's like a division in the university that's supposed to be for engaged teaching to help teachers learn. So I think that any university is probably getting money to improve student retention, graduation, right? And I think that it's really important for administrators at both in undergrad studies as well as faculty affairs to roll out programs that they know both improve student retention and also help faculty improve pedagogy and student engagement.
Thank you so much. Those are terrific ideas, and this whole seminar and conversation has been so thought-provoking, and I thank you all so very much. Dean Tsuyoshi, Professor Ashok, Professor Kwan-Lafond, Professor McCready, thank you for your contributions, for your insights, for sharing your experience. I want to acknowledge again Eileen Egan-Lee for her help in coordinating the event, and thanks to all of you for attending. We wish you well as we all take the questions and insights generated from this discussion with us to help inform our ongoing work, both within and beyond the university context, and as we continue to care for each other and for ourselves in the midst of the pandemic. Take good care, and thank you so much for being here.